Dungok Niliwis Gizuskan. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for that beautiful introduction. My deadly MC, Sylvia, to Michelle, Dee, Fiona, and others on the organizing committee who have been wonderful hosts so far to us, and to Auntie B for her welcome to country, both last night and this morning. Can we give them, please, a round of applause? As you heard the MC say, I support people to see Indigenous individuals and communities through a lens of abundance. Today, I will propose an alternative to approaching community work from a deficit-based approach. I want to share 7 principles of building on abundance in Indigenous communities that I hope will spark ideas for you to apply in your work. With over a decade of experience working with Indigenous leaders through our flagship 5-month Indigenous Women in Community Leadership Program, you'll see our graduates from our 2022 course here in this picture. We at Coady have recognized some really distinct ways in which our graduates approach community work. Growing up and working in my own First Nation has given me a unique insight into our values, wisdom, strengths, and challenges. We have more than 700 Indigenous graduates from our education programs. I have worked closely with over 50 of them as they implement their abundance-based, community-driven projects. With this firsthand knowledge, I hope to guide and inspire you in effectively engaging Indigenous communities. Indigenous people have been building communities in ways that counted on using everyone's gifts for thousands of years. I'm asking you to tap into that wisdom today. I want to talk and acknowledge a little bit about engaging with any community. I think we all encounter challenges. When working with Indigenous communities, we face the ongoing impacts of colonization, systematic oppression, and racism. Understandably, these experiences create layers of trauma and distrust, making community development complex, but addressing these traumas and rebuilding trust needs to be a critical priority. We must also remember that each of our communities has diverse histories, cultural practices, contexts, and unique needs requiring an approach beyond a one-size-fits-all or pan-Indigenous solution. And lastly, I must acknowledge that working in our communities is a long-term commitment, one that may take years to see your impact. I believe we engage more effectively with Indigenous communities by acknowledging and addressing these challenges. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on these 7 principles. We compiled a set of 7 principles after examining more than 40 graduate stories of successful community engagement. While these principles are neither exhaustive nor prescriptive, they draw from the lived experiences of Indigenous people and have been well received by groups we've shared them with. We believe they align with Indigenous values and best practices, but like anything, no set of principles is ever comprehensive or final. Some may resonate with you, your community, or the communities of Indigenous people you work with, while others may not. I encourage you to explore and identify your own principles that come from the work of your community. I will first list the principles and then explore each principle in more detail. So number 1, recognizing the gifts are within every Indigenous person and community. Principle 2, using what we already have. Number 3, starting with spirit. Number 4, placing relationships and connections at the center. Number 5, emphasizing the importance of asking, listening, and sharing stories. Number 6, ensuring inclusive involvement of all community members. And number 7, fostering shared vision and decision-making for future generations. So principle 1, individuals are assets. Each individual already has unique gifts and talents that they bring to the table, whether it be skill sets, visions, passions. Answers to community challenges can begin with building on what we already have. As my colleague says, one arrow can break easily, but it is difficult to break a bundle of arrows together. Their strength comes from collectively being bound together. What are your gifts? What are the gifts of others? How have you used your gifts to contribute to your community? Principle number 2. Each community has resources it can use to start or continue the steps towards community building. It can be the rivers that run through our communities, the plants and medicines that grow in our backyards, or a youth or elder center that goes unused. Once we identify the existing resources, the community can decide how to use them. They invite strategic partners to assist that are prepared to be led by the community. I'll tell a story about this chocolate bar. This is called the Nita Bar. And Buckingeg is a community that is next to Coady, where I work. And they partnered with Peace by Chocolate. It's a chocolate company in Canada, started by Syrian refugees. And they did that because they wanted to build cultural programming in their community. And they looked around to see who their partners were and who the partners were that were willing to take their lead. And so every part of every purchase of this bar goes back to that community to do cultural programming like beading or drum making. I actually have some of these. I probably have about a dozen of them, and I'm happy to share them if you want to come down after I'm done. Number 3 starts with spirit. Incorporating spirit is foundational. Like everything else in Indigenous communities, community development and engagement must be rooted in spirit. This often means engaging in protocols, practices, and ceremonies. We often invite spirit in to start anything in a good way. Just like last night when Auntie B welcomed us to the Cherokee territory and asked us to remember that to get here, we all traveled the sacred way of her ancestors. Number 4, relationships and connections sit at the heart of Indigenous communities. We are often intertwined through social, political, economic, and spiritual ties. For me, at least, other community members are like family, and we all have roles and responsibilities to one another. When people know and practice reciprocal relationships, they become not just passive receivers of outside help, services, or programs. Our elders often talk about being in good relations with everyone and everything. I share this with the participants in my program. Being in good relations with everyone doesn't mean you have to be everyone's best friend. Rather, it means you treat everyone and everything with the dignity and respect they deserve. Number 5. Collective decisions come from connecting, communicating, sharing, and listening to each other's stories, or as we do here, yarning, which we will be doing a lot of this week. When community members feel genuinely heard, valued, and involved in the process, they become more engaged and motivated to take action toward creating the kinds of changes they want to see within their community. This picture comes from our Indigenous Women in Community Leadership gathering from 2019. And that gathering, we definitely tried to take an abundance-based approach. We asked the people in our community, the women that have graduated, we have about 165 graduates just from that program. We asked them what they wanted to talk about, and we asked them to be on an organizing committee. And they were the ones who selected the topics. They were the ones who hosted the events. They're the ones who did the tours and taught us things. I think by listening to our community, we were able to serve them in the best way possible. Number 6, inclusive involvement of all community members. Strength really lies in involving all community members, including elders, leaders, adults, youth, children, and diverse individuals in collective action. Ask yourself, whose voices are being heard? Who is sitting around the decision-making tables? And whose are being excluded? And number 7, many past and present Indigenous communities think about how their decisions will affect future generations and all our relations, including the land. Strong leaders collaborate with community members at every level, involving them in decision-making processes to shape and share a vision for the community's future. I hope these principles and stories have allowed you to shift your perspective and learn from the wisdom of Indigenous community builders and how they engage authentically with their communities and build upon the abundance existing gifts, strengths, and wisdoms. And I don't just know the value of seeing abundance in our communities from my work or the work of our graduates, but from my experience of living as an Indigenous person who did not often feel valued or embraced. I have struggled most of my life with feeling that I do not belong. To illustrate my point, I will tell you about my grandmother. To give you some context, my grandmother was born in 1911, orphaned at a young age. She was a fluent speaker in our Maliseet language. She had a grade school education. She gave birth to 15 children, and she raised me. And she worked as a cleaner in the homes of the wealthy people in town. So at about age 12, we used to walk in the town next to our First Nation community, much like the downtown we've been walking these last few days during the conference. And I was walking with her and one of my friends who I played basketball with, Lori. She yelled out her car hello as they were driving by, and I waved back and said hello. And my grandmother got very angry with me, and she said, "Just ducks," which in our language means to be quiet. I was actually kind of mad. I think for me this was a turning point in my life. I wanted to prove her belief. I think she really believed, I wanted to prove her wrong, that we as Indigenous people were somehow worth less. I can now understand that she was just reflecting her own experiences, in her own way, attempting to protect me. While I was angry about what happened, I also internalized that feeling. Reflecting back now, I can see the pattern. My grandmother, my mother, and then me. I can see how this belief of not being enough caused destruction as it blazed through our lives. And I know it did not originate from just my grandmother. Her reality was that she was a second-class citizen. For my mother, it took the form of alcoholism. For me, I used it to push and fuel my work, to work harder, to be the best. I'm pretty sure it drives my perfectionism and workaholic nature. And while I know now these feelings of not being enough, not being worthy, not belonging, are an outcome of colonized oppression and dealing with racism. And while some may say we live in a post-colonial world, the wounds still feel fresh. So when I say the importance of seeing the abundance in Indigenous people and communities, I speak from a place deep within me that struggles to see my own abundance. And I continue to learn that lesson. I invite you to take the first step in shifting perspective by consciously recognizing and appreciating the gifts, strengths, and wisdoms within yourself and the Indigenous peoples and communities you interact with. You can actively seek opportunities to engage, listen to stories, and value our contributions. Like Auntie B mentioned last night, we will all soon need to embrace the wisdom of Indigenous people. By embracing an abundance-based approach and acknowledging the existing assets within Indigenous people and communities, we can build meaningful connections and relationships and support positive social change. As you return to your life and work, I hope you take up this call to action. Our future depends on it. Wiliwin, and thank you.